Hi guys, this is Andrew with headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to take a look at this. This is the Dunu EST112, which comes in right at around $489. Now the name 112 comes from the driver configuration. There's one dynamic driver for the bass, there's a balanced armature in the mids, and then there's two E-stats for the highs. Let's check it out. Now, as we get going with this review, I want to kind of set the stage for you guys here and where the Dunu EST112 fits in sort of the landscape for, mid to high end IEMs. And I actually think that its biggest competitor comes from Dunu's own SA6, in the sense that the SA6 is, in my opinion, definitively the best IEM that I've heard at around the $500 to $550 price mark. And coming in at considerably more modest price tags, both under $350, the Moondrop Blessing 2 and Blessing 2 Dusk are other competitors within this range, or sort of the lower end of this range. And so the question that I'm hopeful to answer with this review is, does the EST112 do something unique enough within that price range to distinguish itself from the competition, which is very strong competition at around that price range? Okay. So without further ado, let's get into the build, design, comfort, aesthetics, usability, etc. And of course, I'm going to take it out of the case, which is something you also get. This is the same case that you get with the SA6 and the Zen and a number of others. So nothing new there. But it works great. You can throw it into a pocket. So this is the EST112 in all of its glory. And as usual, Dunu has provided a fantastic cable with a modular cable system with ends that can be removed. And then you can use different terminations if you like. This one I have on here is balanced 2.5, but then they give you a number of different terminations as well, like this Pentacon here. Sorry for the crinkling. Of course, Dunu's cables are always excellent. For whatever reason, I feel like this one feels lighter, but maybe not quite as robust as some of the other ones that I've felt from Dunu before. But again, outstanding cable here. Very, very nice. What I love about it is that it doesn't keep its shape. It's not stiff. And it doesn't get in the way when you're listening, when you're just walking around. So I really like that. And as you guys saw in the previous video that I did on this, when I did my first impressions, I took it walking outside and didn't have any issues, with usability there either. As far as the IEMs themselves, they have this sort of silver-looking design here with somewhat of a unique pattern around a Dunu logo. And then, so it's not an acrylic shell here. I really love the comfort of this IEM. Dunu, once again, has knocked it out of the park with comfort, and so I have no issues wearing this for a long period of time. Now, you'll notice that I have the final E-tips on here, and there's a reason for that. And it's because the tips do change the sound a little bit here. And so you may want to tip roll to find out what works best for you, but I'll go over that a little bit in the sound section, which we'll talk about next. But I do want to also mention this does use the MMCX connectors here, and so that's not the 2-pin style. So, some people like it, some people don't. So just like with Dunu's other IEMs, the build, design, comfort, aesthetics, and accessories is all fantastic. They nail it every time with this stuff. Now, let's talk about the sound quality. And first, I'm going to go over the objective data here. So I'll throw up the graphs and you can take a look at the frequency response. Once again, if you're totally new to reading frequency response, I've done a video on how to read this stuff, and I'll leave that linked in the description as usual. But in the case of IEMs, there isn't as strongly a defined target here, so I'll be comparing it to a number of other IEMs. You'll just have to take a look at the legend there to see which is which. Also, when it comes to IEMs, something I often see that's missed is what the coupler is that's being used. And so I'm going to state that the one that I'm using is the Gross RA0402 coupler, and that's not the one that's the 0045 equivalent that you see in other places. So the one that I use doesn't have a resonance peak there at around 8K or somewhere in the mid treble that you often see. So normally when you're looking at those, you sort of expect there to be a resonance peak there, but this one that I'm using doesn't have that. It's more subdued there. And in case looking at the frequency response here, at first glance, it looks pretty good. For bass to mid level, it's a nice transition there. It's not overdone. In fact, the bass here is pretty darn close to what I would consider neutral. It's helped by the dynamic driver here as well, which makes it a little bit more impactful. And then the upper mid-range is also, appropriate for where the lower mid-range is. So sometimes that's a bit of an issue where the upper mid-range is too far, and then this causes vocals to sound a little bit lean and hollow. And that's not the case here. I think it's an appropriate elevation for the ear gain, and it's also an appropriate distance from where the rest of the tuning is there for bass and lower mids. Where things get into trouble, though, with the EST112 is right at around 5K, 6K in the lower treble there. it's a little bit forward relative to the rest of the frequency response. So there's a bit of a bump there. And this has the effect of pronouncing certain harmonics over others. So there's a bit of that sort of lower treble sibilance that comes through, which is definitely something that I find a little bit fatiguing at times. So it's a bit much there for me, not as smooth as I would like, not as gradual as I would like. And also it's important to note here that it's not that the overall level is too much, it's just that it's not as smooth as I think it should be. And so it's just not as well balanced there for lower treble to mid treble to upper treble. It does also seem to roll off a little bit. Perceptively, it doesn't sound quite like it's missing anything there, but also certainly not as well extended as what you get with the audio clairvoyance and some other IEMs that I've listened to recently, like the Tri-Audio Starlight, which is insane in the treble. That'll get its own video. In the meantime, though, the Dunu EST112 is mostly solid for the tuning, except for the lower treble forwardness that does have the effect of pronouncing some of the sh sounds. Now, again, I'd noted before that I was using the final E tips on here, and that's because when you're using the final E tips, it does kind of curb some of that treble, and it also does some things to the bass as well. So I do recommend tip rolling here. Find what works best for you if you have this. Still not ideal, but quite a bit more okay. Meaning that it'll work for a wider range of genres with different tips. So let me give a bit of a summary here of the tuning and frequency response of the Dunu EST112. This is a lot closer to what you get with the Blessing 2, the original Blessing 2, with a even more pronounced lower treble section there. I mean, that was, I think, the only real issue there for the Blessing 2 that could sometimes come across. I mean, I heard it, not everybody heard it, but a few other people noticed it as well. And I think on the EST112, it's even more so, a little forward there. So that's kind of my main complaint with the tuning on this one. Still, though, the rest of the tuning is solid. The bass level is solid. The ear gain is solid. So taking a step back, imagine something kind of similar to the Blessing 2 for overall level of ear gain, just with that emphasis to the lower treble sh sounds, which is not really my jam. And that could be contrasted with what you get with like the Dunu SA6, which again, I think is the best IEM under $550. At least it's the best one that I've heard. That one is a lot more forgiving with a wider range of genres, whereas the EST112 is nowhere near as forgiving. However, there are some genres where this is going to do just fine. And actually, it has the similar effect that the HD800, the original HD800 from Sennheiser did, where some recordings would just sound a little bit shrill. And I hear that going on here as well, where occasionally recordings will be just a little too shrill because of that lower treble emphasis. But then the flip side is there are other recordings that I listen to, like a lot of my jazz tracks are totally fine here. So I think it really just depends. So definitely not what I would use for, rock and metal and anything that's a little bit more aggressive sounding, because there's a lot of tones that can come across a little bit fatiguing and grating there as a result of the lower treble boost. Okay, now let's talk about the subjective stuff and the technical performance, the detail, punch and slam, all the rest of that stuff. You guys know how it goes. And for that, the Dunu EST112 is actually pretty darn good. So the dynamic driver in the bass here does make the bass sound really nice. It's really satisfying, punchy, tactile. The one thing that I noticed, though, is that the first tips that I was using on here, I can't remember which ones that I was using, they weren't large enough, so I wasn't getting a proper seal. And so I initially thought, man, the bass is not that great on this. But then when switching over to the final E tips and just actually other larger silicon tips, and even the foam ones, as long as they're a little bit larger, getting a better seal there. The bass is definitely there on this, very present, and I definitely prefer this kind of bass presentation over what you get with typical multi-BA stuff. I think maybe that's kind of balanced out with the overall bass level here as well, so the perception is going to be that it's more impactful. Now, when it comes to detail retrieval and sort of the microdynamic ability, the trailing ends of tones, this is also excellent. I think for the price point, this is quite competitive and a step up from what you get with a Blessing 2. Just at the same time, those E-stats that in the treble, people often are bothered by that kind of presentation where there's sort of like a lack of tactility in the upper treble, the lack of grip and there's no other way that I can really explain it. So just a very subjective kind of term. And I'm starting to notice that more and more. And I do hear it here as well. But I still think, at this price, the detail trade-offs are potentially worth it. So personally, I don't mind it that much on here, even though I do notice it. And that is also, something that kind of can come through in timbre as well. But it doesn't have that sort of metallic smearing effect of BA timbre. It's just sort of a different kind of presentation that is a bit yeah, softer almost. I don't really know how else to describe that. And keep in mind, these are not real electrostatic drivers. These are just sort of the IEM version, the ESTAT, quote unquote ESTAT drivers, which a lot of people are putting in IEMs these days. There's a lot of tribirds out there. If that's what's responsible for the detail that this has, then that I can see it making a certain amount of sense. And I think in part I also notice that when it comes to the sense of separation, this is pretty good for the overall sense of space and stage and layering and separation. Nothing mind-blowing, but totally competitive for the price range. I think there are, again, some other IEMs in a slightly higher price bracket, around $700, $800, where those differences start to matter a little bit more. And then, again, $1,100, $1,200, $1,300, where you see some other IEMs like the Andromeda, where that stuff, again, is like another level. So for technical performance, this I think plays ball with the SA6. It's right up there for detail and for incisiveness and all the rest of those qualities, just with a slightly different timbral quality there to the treble, or I don't know what else to call that, an E-stat kind of presentation. You kind of have to hear it to know what that is. And some people are kind of thrown off by it, and other people don't really seem to mind it all that much. And I fall somewhere in between. Now, let me just run through a couple comparisons here. Again, compared to the SA6 is the IEM that is a lot more forgiving for a wider range of music, and it's still the one that I'm going to recommend. If you're looking at this, I would recommend spending a little bit more on the SA6, unless you want this kind of presentation, which is, again, I hesitate to say more neutral compared to that one, even though there is also a forwardness to the lower treble on the EST112. And then again, compared to the Blessing 2, the original, this is, again, more similar to that as far as the overall ear gain level, but just not quite as smooth in the treble there. And so in some ways, I would take the Blessing 2 over this. It's just that this does have better detail and technicalities. Now, there are other IEMs around this price, but I think those are the big ones to consider. And again, because I don't think this stuff scales in a linear fashion with price, every time, it's something where including something like the Softears RSV, I think is worthwhile, or RS5, because this is actually something that I was comparing. I've been also evaluating in conjunction with this one and kind of going back and forth. And it is interesting to note that the detail on this is actually competitive with the RSV, in my opinion. And I'll do a review of the RSV in a little bit here, but that kind of gives you a sense of where I hear the detail of this. Does it punch above its weight? Sort of, but that also might not be worth the trade-off in the tuning, because I do think that the tuning of the RSV is definitely better than what you get with the EST112. It's a little bit more balanced there in the transition between the upper mids and the treble, making it a little bit more agreeable to listen to for long periods of time. However, I would definitely take the EST112 over the RSV personally, because this is so much more comfortable to wear. I actually have trouble with the RSV's. The nozzle on it is like way too thick for my ear, but for the sound quality, the RSV, the tuning is definitely better. Okay, let me now give my conclusion here. Is the Dunu EST112 worth it? I'm actually going to say this is a much more difficult IEM to recommend because the SA6 exists at a very similar price. It's not much more to get the SA6. And as an all-rounder, the SA6 I think is just more agreeable across the board. Where you might want to consider this is if you listen to jazz, classical, and acoustic, and you're looking for something that is a little bit more forward there in the upper mid-range, has a bit more ear gain to it. And so it makes perfect sense to come out with something like the EST112 that aims for a more neutral presentation overall. And so I get the intention to do this. And I get why it would also be priced at around, pretty close to the SA6, just under $500. However, I don't really think that there is much reason to go for this because the SA6 exists. Ultimately, the way that I would sum up the EST112 is that for most of its sound quality, it's fantastic, it's excellent, with one drawback, and that one drawback is significant enough to make it difficult to recommend over Dunu's own slightly higher priced counterpart, the SA6, in which case, for me personally, that's just the one that I would end up going for instead. Now, if you happen to listen to the genres that, this is not fatiguing with, like jazz, acoustic, and classical, and that kind of stuff, then the detail benefits of this may outweigh that tuning drawback, and then it might be worth it for you. But for me, this becomes a more difficult IEM to recommend, given the competition and given the rest of the landscape that exists there. In any case, that does it for this review. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.